Once, upon some long ago time, there was an old widow who lived in a tiny house in the forest. Wait a second. Tiny house? You know? Maybe they meant tiny house. Oh man, to think I've been saying it wrong all these years. So the old widow lived in a tiny house in the forest. She kept 2 rose bushes in front of the house, and every year they'd bloom with the most beautiful flowers. One bush had red and the other had white. The woman had 2 daughters who were beautiful and sweet and pretty much just the perfect kids. She had named them Snow White and Rose Red because, according to her, they were just like the 2 rose bushes. Neither of the girls were ever really quite sure what she meant by this, but they were polite, and so they always just kind of went along with it. Rose Red was the more outgoing of the 2, and so she would always be constantly out and about, running over the meadows and the fields, catching butterflies, picking flowers, and just generally exploring around. Sometimes Snow White would go along, but usually during these times she preferred to just stay at home with her mom, and she'd do things like the cooking, or maybe she'd help out with the housework, or even just hang around and practice breakdancing. When they'd all go out, they were always smiling, and the sisters would often go hand in hand, just a really happy, loving family. "We shall never desert each other. No, not so long as we live. Whatever one gets, she shall share with her sister. But what if one of us gets pregnant?" Probably the favorite pastime of the sisters was to roam around in the woods. Maybe they'd play hide and seek or pick berries. Now, this was just like any other forest. It wasn't entirely the safest place in the world. There were dangerous creatures who lived there. For example, if it were you walking along in those trees, I'd almost guarantee that you'd probably get this creepy feeling. Maybe you'd start seeing glowing eyes lurking all around, not quite within reach, but close enough to induce some real nervousness. Not these girls. They made friends with everyone, no matter what kind of beastie. It got to where the creatures would just come right up to them in a really confiding manner. "Hey man, I gotta tell you something. It was me who went through your garbage last week." And not just the furry ones. Even the birds would get close to the girls and sing to them. The beautiful, ancient, haunting melodies of the woods. "Oh, Stubble was a racehorse, and I wish he were mine." All in all, the 2 girls had it pretty good. Every once in a while, maybe they'd lose track of time and end up out in the woods well after dark or something. But if that happened, they'd typically just find a good mossy spot to stretch out on, spend the night, and head home the next morning. Times were different back then, so their mom wouldn't worry. She just knew they were safe, and that was that. Nothing bad ever seemed to happen. Here's an example. One time when the sisters had ended up spending the night in the woods, they woke up the next morning and noticed this beautiful, glimmering girl dressed in white just a few feet from their makeshift campsite. "What is that?" It's a ghost. Gesundheit. After she'd vanished, the girls walked over to examine the spot where she'd been and couldn't help but notice that they were now standing at the edge of a huge precipice. If they'd gone any farther into the darkness, they would have ended up tumbling right over the edge. After they got home, they told their mom about the encounter, and she told them that they must have seen the angel that guards good children. As they grew, life just continued on like this. The mom never seemed to worry about housework because the girls seemed to take care of everything without even being asked. Rose Red always seemed to be more on top of things in the summer, and she'd always make sure to put 2 flowers beside her mom's bed every day, one from each rose bush. In the winter, it was Snow White who would tend to all the extra details and would make sure the big brass kettle was lit every day. When the evenings were long and snow was falling in big sticky flakes outside, their mom would say, "Snow White, go close the shutters," and then they'd all spend the evening gathered up around the fire. Sometimes they'd drink hot chocolate and talk about their day, maybe play a game of poker, or sometimes Mom would just read aloud to them from a big book. It was a winter evening quite like this that we come to the main events of our story. By this point, I'd say the girls were probably in their mid-teens. Young enough that their moms still thought of them as children, but old enough that by the viewpoints of their society, they were actually considered to be more of an adult age. On this particular evening, the little family was cozied up around the fire as usual when they were suddenly interrupted by a loud knocking at the front door. Mom immediately said, "Rose Red, go and open the door. It must be some poor traveler seeking shelter from the snow and cold." So Rose Red hops up and without hesitation goes down the hall to the door, and when she opened it, for a split second she thought she saw the clear shape of a man standing there in the falling snow. But then she looked a second time and saw that it was actually this enormous shaggy bear who stood there. The bear kind of pokes his head inside the door, and Rose Red does what I think most teenage girls would have at that point, screams bloody murder and runs back inside for her life. For a minute it was complete chaos in the house, since Snow White immediately joins in on the screaming, plus there was some general running around, knocking into each other, trying to find a good hiding spot, etc., etc. But finally there came a moment with enough of a pause for the bear to say, "Wait, please don't be afraid. I swear I won't hurt you, but I am half frozen, and only need to warm up a little, if you don't mind." The mom, I guess, sees the kindness in the bear's eyes as he spoke and quickly ushers him inside, doing the typical mom thing, "Oh, you poor little bear, come on in. Lay down by the fire. Take care not to burn your fur now." Then she calls out to the girls, "Snow White, Rose Red, come on out. This bear won't harm you. He's a good, honest creature." The two girls eventually did come out of their hiding spaces and approach the bear. He was so gentle that it didn't take them long at all to make friends with him, and pretty soon they were brushing the tangles from his fur and playing with him just like he were a big dog. Rolling him around on the floor and so forth. Generally, he'd just take it all, or maybe pretend to growl at them. Once or twice they maybe did get a little too rough, but in those cases the bear would just calm them down by saying, "Oh, spare my life, Snow White and Rose Red." Eventually it came time for the family to go to bed, and the mom invited the bear to spend the night right there on the hearth, so he could keep sheltered from the cold, wet snow. Of course he accepted the offer and spent a really comfortable night inside. When the morning came, the girls opened the door for him. He thanked them and trotted off into the woods out of sight. From that point on, the bear would make a regular appearance at their cottage about the same time every evening. He'd lay down by the fire and let Snow White and Rose Red play their pranks on him. The girls always made sure that the front door was kept unlocked until he was safe in the house for the night, and he pretty quickly started to feel like a member of the family. Eventually, as it usually tends to do, spring came around again. Snow melted, everything started to turn green, and the bear one morning told Snow White that he had to leave them and couldn't return until winter. Of course she was upset by this and asked, "Well, where are you going, my dear bear?" He answered that he must go deep into the forest in order to guard his treasure from the dwarves. This wasn't something he'd had to worry about over the winter because of the weather. The ground would get so hard from the snow that the evil little creatures just couldn't break through, and they'd end up being stuck underground in their lairs for months. Now, however, since the permafrost was melting, the dwarves would be able to work their way up and out, and they could go about their business, which consisted mostly of spying around, stealing whatever they could get their grubby little hands on. And I have to say that any item they were able to get a hold of and take with them down to their caves was not easily gotten back again. So even though Snow White was really sad that her friend had to go away, she understood the situation and unlatched the door for him one last time. As the bear made his exit, he unknowingly caught a lock of fur on the door knocker, and for a brief moment Snow White thought she saw a glint of gleaming gold underneath. She couldn't be certain, though, and ended up just staring curiously at the bear as he made his hasty retreat through the trees. The next few weeks felt really odd since the family had grown accustomed to having the bear around. But eventually they started to get back into their old routines, and not long after his departure, the mom asked her daughters to go collect some brushwood for the fire. The girls venture out into the woods, and after walking a while, they start to finally get close to a big tree that's fallen over on the ground. As they got closer, they started to notice something moving around, but they couldn't really distinguish what it was until they reached a distance of only a few feet away. Turns out the thing was a dwarf, with a wizened face and a magnificent white beard. Must have been at least a yard long. The beard, they noticed, was pinned tightly in a crack in the tree, and the dwarf didn't really know what to do. He was just springing around like a madman trying to free himself. He'd probably been doing this for some time and was only getting himself tangled up worse and worse as time went on. Pretty soon the dwarf saw that he was no longer alone and he started yelling out at the girls. "What are you morons doing just standing there? Come and help me already!" The girls, having lived in the area their whole lives, were familiar with the attitudes of dwarves, and so they weren't really shaken by the rudeness. Rose Red calmly asked him what had happened, and he politely replied, "You stupid you're in algebra class. The porcupine's back end. I was obviously trying to split wood for the kitchen fire, but when I drove the wedge into the tree, it was so slippery that it sprang right out. There was no time to remove my beautiful silky beard, so here it is caught fast. I can't get away, and you wretched girls just stand there and stare at me like with no in the aquarium Tuesday in July." So the girls did everything in their power to try to help the little guy out of his predicament, but it was just no use. Anything they would attempt just seemed to get him stuck even more. Finally, Rose Red suggested that she could go fetch someone else for more help, but the dwarf wouldn't have it and started to get really angry, telling them how having 2 other people here already was way too much for him to handle. At this point, Snow White starts to get a little impatient, pulls her scissors from her pocket, and simply snips off the very tip of the beard. As soon as the dwarf was freed, he instantly seized up a little bag of gold that had fallen under the tree during the ordeal and hustled off in the opposite direction, without a thank you or even a second glance at the 2 girls. Unless, of course, you count cursing them under his breath until he was out of earshot. A couple days later, the sisters were out and about again, this time to catch some fish for dinner. As they approached the river, they started to see an odd, jerky movement by the banks. From their vantage point, it almost looked like an enormous grasshopper trying to jump into the water. They drew nearer and realized it was none other than that same dwarf who was causing the commotion. Rose Red called out to him to ask what he was doing. Surely he wasn't going to jump in the river after all. The dwarf screamed back, in his customary genteel manner, that of course he wasn't going to jump, and that this wretched fish was trying to drag him in. Apparently, he'd been sitting on the bank fishing when a sudden gust of gravity had caught the remaining portion of his beard and had tangled it fast to the line just as a big fish bit down. The dwarf probably couldn't have reeled this massive thing in on the best of days, but now that his beard was securely intertwined with the fishing line, he just didn't have a chance. The fish was slowly dragging him down the bank as he clung with all his might to anything he could find along the way, and by now he was pretty close to being pulled into the water. It seemed the girls had come along just in the nick of time. They ran down to the dwarf, grabbed a hold of him, and tried everything they could think of to get him free. But it just wasn't gonna happen. The beard was so tangled in the fishing line that once again the only thing they could do was to produce the scissors and sacrifice another little piece of the beard. The dwarf was kinda battered and in shock from his struggle, so it actually took him a few seconds this time to realize just how he'd been set free. He thanked them in his usual manner, of course. "Do you call that manners to disfigure a fellow's face, you a rotten zucchini on? It wasn't enough that you cut my beard before, but now you cut off the best bit of it. I won't dare show myself like this in front of my own people. I wish you'd never come at all, you a rhinoceros with Kelsey Grammer's left." And with that, the little man picked up a sack of pearls that had fallen into the reeds and promptly ran off, disappearing out of sight behind some stones. A few more days go by, and Mom decides to send the sisters into town to pick up some basic sewing supplies: needles, thread, chainsaw blades, lace, sandpaper, and ribbon. The route they decided to take would lead them over a big field where these huge boulders lay scattered around. As they got to this point in the path, the girls noticed a large bird of prey gliding around in the air above them, circling lower and lower around the field until finally it touched down near one of the boulders, and the girls began to hear a muffled screaming noise coming from the spot it had landed. They got closer and started to make out that it looked like an eagle? Yes, it was an eagle, and wouldn't you know it, held fast in its talons was their old friend the dwarf. Without delay, the sisters sprang across the field and grabbed the dwarf, just as his captor was about to take flight. It was a vicious struggle, but at last they were able to tire the bird out so much that it gave up, let go of the dwarf, and flew off into the distance, most likely to go order a takeout calzone. The dwarf picked himself up from the ground where he'd fallen, looked himself over, and, as the girls were accustomed to by now, proceeded to berate them, this time because they had let the eagle's talons rip his fine and elegant coat to shreds. Once he'd had his say, he snatched up a small pouch of precious gemstones that had fallen through one of the holes in his jacket and scampered down through a crevice in the rocks, presumably to head back to his underground lair. Snow White and Rose Red were so used to these encounters by now that they thought nothing more of it and headed on into town for their shopping. Nothing eventful happened there to speak of, aside from them finding an impressive sale on used saxophone components. But when they were on their way back home, and passed again through the rocky field, they once more stumbled upon Mr. Congeniality. He had reemerged from his rocky hideout, thinking that surely no one else would pass by this late in the day, and was presently taking inventory of his latest pilfered treasure. The jewels were sparkling so brightly in the evening sun that the sisters couldn't help but take a moment and gaze at them. As the dwarf spied them staring down, his face became a scarlet shade of red, and he asked the girls, "What are you two standing there gaping for?" He was gathering up his pile of gems as he raged, preparing to rush off yet again, when a loud and sudden growling noise erupted from the forest behind him. Suddenly, a massive shaggy bear emerged from the shadows of the trees and began to race toward them. The dwarf tried to make a run for it, but have you ever tried to outrun a bear? It's not as easy as you'd think, and therefore the bear ended up reaching the dwarf in a matter of seconds. Everything happened so quickly that the sisters could do nothing more than watch the scene unfold. The dwarf's reddened face paled to a pasty white as he started to plead with his approaching assailant. "Spare me, Mr. Bear. You don't want a puny little thing like me. Come on. I'll give you all my treasure. There, look over at those two girls. Eat them instead." And so on and so forth. Now, this begging worked out about as well as you might think, and with one blow of the bear's mighty paw, that was that. No more dwarf. By now, the girls had realized that maybe they'd better get out of there, and were sprinting toward home, already a couple 100 yards away. But then the bear called after them, "Snow White, Rose Red, wait up, I'll come with you." They recognized his voice. It was the very same bear that they'd befriended the past winter. So they stopped and let him catch up to them. But as he grew closer, his shaggy fur started to fall off, more and more the nearer he got. When he reached a point of, maybe about 15 feet away, he was completely transformed. No longer did a bear stand in front of them, but a tall, handsome young man dressed in gleaming gold. He confessed to the girls that he was actually the son of a king. Some months ago, he had caught the wicked dwarf trying to make off with some of his treasure, but for whatever reason hadn't been able to overpower him, and the dwarf had ended up enchanting him. Just the basic kind of curse stuff. The prince would be doomed to roam around the forest as a bear until the death of the dwarf should set him free, and the presence of the girls had distracted the dwarf enough so that the prince bear could finally make that happen. So, epilogue. Happily ever after. Snow White ended up marrying the prince, and Rose Red married his brother. The four of them ended up living together in their very own tiny castle, where Mom had an apartment above the garage. She, of course, brought her 2 rose trees with her, replanted them outside, and every year they kept on blooming with their beautiful red and white roses.